Hi, I'm Elizabeth Parks, and I'm an assistant professor of communication studies at Colorado State University and the dialogue and diversity specialist for the Center for Public Deliberation. Today, I want to chat with you a bit about how we can all improve our listening skills to promote better dialogue, whether that be online or offline. Ultimately, what I hope that we all get from today is a more clear understanding of what listening entails and how we can all become better listeners in our day-to-day lives, both in our interpersonal relationships, but also in our communities, of bringing people to the table and really listening to them in a way that they feel heard and that we are learning more about not just what they have to say, but about who we all are together. So what I'd like you to do first is to pause and really take stock of what you're listening to at this very moment. Now you might be thinking, well, I was listening to silence, or I've been listening to this voice. And oftentimes when I ask people this question, the first things that come to mind are the things that we access through our ears. So maybe it's the noise of a road outside. Maybe it is a dog barking. Maybe it is the voice of somebody who is speaking to you. Maybe it is music in the background. But oftentimes in the United States, our first go-to is to think about listening as being equated with our ears. But there's lots of reasons that listening involves so much more than this. Think about the last time that you walked into a place and smelled fresh bread or freshly baked cookies or a cup of hot coffee, or pick something that you particularly love. In that moment, the ways that you're thinking about that space, the ways that you are engaging with what's going on is shifting because you're listening through your nose, through the smells. Now, I work with the deaf community quite a lot, and for this particular community, the way that they listen might be primarily through their eyes, so it's a visual culture. So maybe if you think about listening through your sight, you might say, oh, I'm listening to the way that the sun is rising or setting. I'm listening to the way that even though this person says they're okay, something about their eyes, about the way that they're holding their body tells me, maybe they're not okay. Maybe your eyes are saying, oh, I can hear these words through my ears, but there's all this movement that I'm really distracted. What the point is here is to really start to expand the ways we think about what listening is, to not just be about hearing, but also to be about the many, many different senses that make up our everyday experiences. So as we go through this series of information, I'd like you to keep that in mind, that what we're doing with each other in dialogue, in deliberation, in the spaces where we're really holding space to come to a better understanding of what has been and what is currently happening now and what we want to plan for in the future, it needs to involve all of us. It needs to involve all of our senses, and showing up in that way can really make a big difference. So today, here's our main points. Some of them will be quick, some of them will take a little bit longer, but here's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the ABCs of listening, kind of the core parts of what makes up a listening part of the communication process. We're going to talk about our intentions. What do we want when we're listening? What do we mean by saying, I'm not listening or you're not listening? We're going to talk about listening not just as receiving information or making sense of the words or the nonverbals like the facial expressions that people use, but actually more as kind of a first step of communication, about issuing out an invitation that, hey, if you speak, I'm here. I'm waiting for you. I want to have this connection. And that connection is going to be further expanded on as I talk to you about one brief thing of philosophy related to our eye contact, or the ways that we think about what we're focusing on. And that is this conversation about a fusion of horizons. From there, we're going to look a little bit about how we can create spaces for each other that are what we call confirming. In other words, they're good. People feel good setting up their shop there. They feel good about having this conversation with each other. They feel like I am being heard, I am being respected, I feel like I'm being a part of this process, and it was worth my time to show up with my whole self. The HURIER model of listening relates to all the different parts of listening. And hopefully by the time we get there, you'll realize that, some parts of listening are really easy for you. And then there's other parts of listening that actually could be really hard. And walking through this model will help us kind of identify our own strengths, but also our own weaknesses and places that we can improve. And recognize that when we get to a table and we're listening to each other, we all arrive into that space with different strengths and different weaknesses. We don't all listen in the same way, and being empathetic to the ways that each other shows up and understanding of our unique backgrounds and what we're carrying into the situation that day can really help us listen better. From there, we're going to move into talking about noise. And yes, we're going to talk about physical noise, the type of jackhammer outside that's just super loud and prevents me from hearing you at all. But we're going to talk about some other kinds of noise too that can get in the way of us listening to each other well. We're going to wrap it all up by debunking 5 listening myths that hopefully by the time we get there will feel very obvious to you of why they're wrong. And then we're going to apply this briefly to the situation of dialogue, where we want a community to come together or a group of people come together and really hear each other out, really listen and learn with each other about where we're at now and where we might want to go together in the future. So here we go. First off, the ABCs of listening. Now, listening is what we call multidimensional. So what that means is that there are so many things going on when we're listening to each other. It's not just about, I hear your words and therefore I understand what you said and now we can move on. Listening is about kind of 3 different parts. The first part is what we call affective, and this relates to the word affect, which relates to emotions. Basically, the affective part or the affective dimension of listening asks us as listeners, are you motivated to attend to others? Do you even care about understanding? How are you thinking about listening in this moment? So I'd like you to pause and just think in your own life about the people that you just can't wait to listen to. Maybe it's because you love them that much, or maybe it's because you respect what they have to say in their expertise, or maybe it's because you really need this information in order to do your job well. Whatever it is, that affective part of listening is you showing up into that space and saying, I want to be here, I want to understand, and I'm really motivated to stay engaged. That's the positive side. On the negative side, we might show up into spaces and be like, I actually already know I don't like this person. And so it becomes very, very difficult to want to listen to them at all. Or we might show up and say, you know what? I know this person so well. I know exactly what they're going to say. And so we tune them out because we think, I've already heard this 1,000 times, so I don't need to listen one more time. I don't actually care about this moment and paying attention to them. So every day, every minute, every moment of dialogue, we're making these subconscious and sometimes very conscious decisions about whether or not we want to listen. And that's the affective part of listening. The B of the ABCs of listening is behavior. So do you know how to respond with appropriate verbal feedback or nonverbal feedback? In other words, do you know when somebody is speaking to you, how to show them that you're listening, how to give them appropriate head nods or head shakes, how to make appropriate eye contact, or maybe not? Do you know what kind of questions to ask? Do you know how to reflect back to them like a mirror? I heard you, and I think this is what you're saying, and really seek out clarification if you maybe just didn't get it right. Do you know when it's appropriate to look at your cell phone versus turning that cell phone over or even turning it off and not having it interrupt that space? Do you know how to lean forward to show, hey, I'm really engaged, or lean back to say, you know what, I'm relaxed and I'm okay in this space to show up in this way. All of those little decisions are based so much on different relational cues, different expectations of how we show up as a professional or as a person in this space. And that is one of the other dimensions of listening. So we have affective as motivation, we have behavior of what we do to invite that listening. And the third part, the C, is cognition. And basically this means what's going on in your head. Are you attending to understanding, receiving, and interpreting the messages that you're hearing appropriately and correctly? So in other words, when you listen to someone and they say something, are you able to walk away with a full understanding of what the meaning was? Now imagine you're a whiz at math and you go into a meeting with engineers or finance people, you go into a math classroom and you're sitting there and they're talking about equations, they're talking about algorithms, they're talking about all of these different ways of seeing the world, and you're like, I get it, right? I understand what they're saying, I can track, I can follow what is happening, right? Cognitively, you're listening and you get it. Now imagine you're somebody else that you're like, yep, not a math whiz. In fact, avoided every math class I could. I hear the word math and I cannot tune in because I'm so stressed out. Maybe that's you and you're like, you know what? I have no idea what you're saying with these numbers. I am completely lost. You may want to understand affectively. You may even be doing all the behavioral stuff of like showing up, making eye contact, nodding your head, and even like really, really tuning in. But cognitively, you just don't get it. You just can't make sense of it. This often even happens when we are working with people who speak languages that we don't speak. If it's an English with a particular accent that we fully understand, it might be really easy to mentally understand and listen. But imagine you're speaking with somebody who speaks English from a part of the country or the world that has an accent that you aren't familiar with. Then it might be very much more difficult to understand the messages, the words, the accents, and you might not actually appropriately or correctly interpret what they're saying. This is true within languages, but it's also true across languages. What if you have somebody at the table who speaks Mandarin, who speaks Spanish, who speaks French, who speaks any other kind of language? You just may not be able to get it because cognitively you just don't understand. Right? So these are the affective, behavioral, and cognitive parts of listening, the ABCs of listening, and everything that we talk about from here on out is wrapped up in being able to accomplish all of these things, do all of these things really well. So imagine you show up in a meeting and you're like, okay, my goal here is to facilitate everybody being able to say what they really believe. And my goal is to really understand cognitively, mentally, to really grasp what their point is. And I want everybody else to be able to do that too. Well, one of the things we know about listening, because it has to do with our motivations, is that sometimes we show up to spaces and we don't actually even know what we're listening for. Why are we even here? What's our aim? What's our purpose? What do we plan to achieve in listening? How can we really engage in that space if we don't even know why we're doing it or what we're hoping to accomplish? A lot of my research is showing the same thing over and over and over again. It's that when we ask people from all different backgrounds, from all different identities, from all different communities, hey, what is it about listening that you would consider most important? What does it mean to listen well? There's one thing that keeps coming out over and over again, and it's this. In order to listen well or to feel listened to, I need to know that the other person is trying to listen to me, that they're trying to learn what I have to say, who I am as a person. And if I can see that their intention is to learn, I'm much more likely to feel heard. much more likely to feel understood. I'm much more likely to feel invited to the table. So one of the things that we can do as facilitators and just listeners in general is to be clear, to be honest, and to be complete about what our intentions are as listeners, and then to communicate them very clearly to the people around us. Because ultimately listening, again, it's not just about a passive role of sitting back and letting information wash over you. Listening is about invitation. It's about saying, hey, you are welcome in this space. You are not excluded. You are not out there. I want you here at this table. I want you in this conversation. I don't want you to kind of lurk on the periphery. And in online spaces, this is even more important perhaps than face-to-face spaces, because it's so easy to feel not seen as we sit behind our screens, as we engage in these kind of online dialogues. But there are ways that we can show other people, hey, I'm looking out for you. I not only will listen because I have to, but because I'm motivated to, because I have the affective will to, because ultimately my desire is to learn about you, what you have to say, and to learn together about what we need to do in the future. And so I invite you by the way I show up with the words I say, by saying, hey, or welcome, or calling someone's name out, that you see them and that they're welcome. And that voice of welcome can go a long way in building the kind of spaces that we want. It can help us build rapport or connection with other people purely by saying, I want to know you, or I want to learn about you. That learning connection is how we can move the dialogue forward in our listening spaces and as listeners. So how do we pull that off? How do we move from, okay, I want that. I want that connection. I want that rapport. I want that feeling of I am inviting you to the table. How do we do that in the day-to-day? Well, there's three pieces that communication researchers and scholars say are really important for building the kind of communication climates or environment or context that allows us all to feel connected with each other, to allow us all to feel like, yeah, we're in this together. And that set of three things are recognition, acknowledgement, and endorsement. So first of all, when we go into an online space or a face-to-face space, one thing we can do as listeners is to really kind of check ourselves and say, have I done the first step, which is to recognize that this person is here? It's as simple as saying, I see you, I hear you. Just that pure sense of a person knowing that they're not invisible, that they're not left to the margins, that they are here at the table and their presence and their time is valued enough to be seen, to be recognized, is the first step of building rapport. The second step of creating a climate or a space that feels warm and sunny and happy is to acknowledge them. So yeah, I see you, but also I'm with you. I acknowledge that we're in this relationship, we're in this space together. And that is an important piece because it's not as if we want to function in a group as a bunch of individuals. Ultimately, we want to be learning together. We want to be listening together. And that communication of I'm with you here shows that we're not in isolate. We're not just individuals. We're moving from individuals into a community. The third and final step of creating this rapport and connection is endorsement. In other words, another way of thinking about how you can endorse a person in that space is to think about it in the framework of I'm for you. All right, so I'm for you doesn't mean necessarily that you completely agree with them. It doesn't mean that you necessarily agree with their ideas. It doesn't even mean that you necessarily agree with how they're showing up. Maybe they're super combative. Maybe they're super aggressive and you just don't like that kind of conversation. If that's you, you can still endorse someone or say, I'm for you, because you want their good. You want their best. You want their well-being. And people can feel that when you say, you know, I don't actually agree with you, but I really want you here. Your voice is important. I am going to make space at the table for you. So as listeners, we can help build connection in our groups by really consciously, through the words we say and the ways we smile or don't smile, lean in toward people or lean away from them, cross our arms or put stuff in between us or clear out that space, say, hey, you know what? I see you, I'm with you, and I'm for you. And those three subtle shifts can make people feel more and more included in the conversation in a really quick amount of time, simply by using people's names in recognizing them, simply by using pronouns and words like we to say, I'm with you, we are in this together, and also I'm for you, hey, I got your back. I'm going to make sure that other people don't talk over you. I'm going to make sure your voice is heard. So there's these kind of pieces that we want to do, and we want to create messages through our listening that are what we call confirming. In other words, positive, helpful. So on the right side of your screen, what you'll see are words related to how we can create positive, I confirm that this is a good space for our people. They're related to kind of big words here, but I'll break them down: provisionalism, spontaneity, problem orientation, description, empathy, and equality. And as I walk through this slide, I'm going to give you on the left side the stuff we kind of want to avoid as listeners. The disconfirming listening patterns, the ones that basically are saying, you know what, I don't like you, I don't see you, I don't want to be with you, and I'm certainly not for you, I'm against you. So this is the stuff we want to avoid. So first off, certainty. Sometimes when we communicate listening through our questions or through the ways that we reflect back to people or by the ways that we don't smile or embrace people with our facial expressions and other body language pieces, is by communicating that we're just so sure. Like, we're so sure that we're not even going to be willing to learn about somebody else's way of doing things. And that could be their idea, but it could also be their process of going through a conversation. So think about it this way. If you're having a conversation with somebody and you are listening to them kind of wrestle through what to do in the future, and you respond as a listener saying something like, you know what? The right thing to do is crystal clear here. That communicates certainty. And if the other person is really wrestling with, well, I don't know what to do here, or I don't know what we should do here, it's actually a little bit demeaning. It's a sense of, well, I know, get on board. So instead of that kind of certainty type of response to the conversation, we can actually introduce what we call provisionalism. In other words, you know what, I'm not really sure exactly what the right answer is here. So a way of saying this would be like, you know what, listening to you, I can see that there's a lot of different ways of thinking about this problem, right? You're not exactly certain what the answer is. And so it gives space for people to say, okay, if there are a lot of different ways of thinking about this problem, then what are they? And that can move the conversation along. Another strategy that can be really unhelpful is to create a strategy of exactly how things are going to play out. So imagine that you're at work and you just found out that you have to run this other errand because you had a crisis come up or because something happened. So you turn to your coworker and you're like, hey, don't you owe me a favor from when I covered for you at work last month? Now imagine getting that message, right? Wait a minute. Now how do I say no? Because you gave something for me and now I have to give it to you because you have backed me into a corner. It doesn't leave people feeling open. It feels like they can't say no or disagree. And so that can become a really negative space all of a sudden. Whereas if you had actually just responded a little bit more spontaneously and said, hey, I just found out I have a conflict with my work schedule. Would you mind helping me out? Sure, okay, maybe they did give you a favor last week. But maybe by you just opening the space and just asking more spontaneously of like, this happened, can you help me? It allows people to say yes and feel good about saying yes, not as if they're just doing something because they have to, or if they can't say yes, if they need to say no without feeling guilty. Another way that we can communicate negativity and kind of create this disconfirming space is to be communicating as a listener based off of control. So sometimes as facilitators, we're trying to keep a conversation moving forward. We're trying to get from point A to point B, and so we're really controlling of how the conversation plays out. Now, if you have this kind of control, if people want to offer something different, if they need more time to think, if they have noticed something that maybe you didn't notice, it's really hard for them to break in. And so my suggestion as we become listeners in these spaces is, yeah, we need to direct the conversation, but we also need to approach things from a problem orientation. For example, instead of saying, okay, we have 15 minutes left in this conversation, these are the 3 things we're going to get through, we have 5 minutes for each one, go, and maybe ignoring which ones are more important for the people at the table than others, you can actually introduce a problem and say, hey, y'all, we have 15 minutes left and there are 3 things we need to get through. How would you like to move forward from here? A 4th type of disconfirming listening message is evaluation. Now, sometimes when we hear something or we see something happening in our groups, we have judgments about it. It doesn't match what we expect. It doesn't match our culture. It doesn't match our background. And so we might be tempted to be like, oh my word, would you stop acting so immaturely, right? But that word, immature, is actually an evaluation, and it can be read as criticism. It can be read as not recognizing and really supporting them. It can invalidate them. And so instead of saying an evaluation statement about their behavior, maybe you could try describing what you're seeing and allowing them to evaluate it themselves. So perhaps saying something like, I see that your voice has changed and it sounds troubled. Could you talk to me more about what that means? It allows people to maybe recognize the same behavior that you're trying to draw attention to kind of get the communication to shift, but without you coming in and evaluating and judging and putting them on the defensive. Description allows people to make sense of it from their own perspective, and maybe it will help you understand and learn, and they will feel more listened to when you do that as well. Neutrality is something that on one side feels like it should be really good. So maybe you're like, you know what, I see this conversation playing out and I want to say super neutral, and you say, you know, I see this argument, but I don't want to get involved in your disagreement. Now, on one side, it feels like that could be a good thing. But what happens when you say, I don't want to get involved, is that people don't feel endorsed. They don't feel like you're with them. And they certainly don't feel like you're for them because you don't want to get involved. And so instead, I would encourage us all to, as listeners, practice empathy. You don't have to agree with anybody who's in conflict. Not with what they have to say or with their argument, but you can be empathetic toward everyone. So instead of saying, I don't want to get involved in your disagreement, maybe you could say something like, wow, that sounds really hard. I can see that this is really challenging for what is going on right now. How do you think we should move forward? So you both affirm how they're feeling. You understand this is tough, and you communicate you're with them, but you also offer a way to move through. Now, finally, I would really encourage us all to avoid feelings of superiority. So sometimes when you're listening to people, you're like, I can't believe you got yourself into that situation. I can't believe that you were so dumb. But really, that kind of air of superiority makes people feel like they can't open up in that situation because, well, shoot, I should have known better. I shouldn't have been in this space. Instead of inviting them, remember, listening is all about inviting them into a space in which you're like, hey, we're going to get through this together. So maybe you could say, instead of, I can't believe you got yourself into this predicament, you know what? It may be a different situation, but I can think of a time when I ended up in a tough situation too. What do you think we should do? Or what are you going to do about it? And so you communicate equality. They're not alone. You're in it with them. All of this leads to us getting to the table and having a conversation in a way that says, as a listener, I'm willing to meet you here. My background may not be the same as yours. My perspective may not be the same as yours. I'll never be able to stand on the same common ground with you, but I can choose in this moment for my own place in the world to look out and to share the same point of the horizon with you. So imagine you're sitting and you're looking out at a sunset, and your perspective of that sunset and the person down the beach is not exactly the same. You're not in the same position in the world. You don't have the same knowledge. You don't have the same perspective, but you're still sharing that spot on the horizon. You're still both sharing that moment with the sunset. And that ability to share that space is really what eye contact is all about. Oftentimes when I ask people, how do you be a good listener? They'll say, nod your head, make good eye contact. And these are generally good rules, I would say. But at the same time, there's lots of people who maybe can't make eye contact. Maybe they are autistic. Maybe they are blind. Maybe they are driving. Maybe eye contact is not the best thing for that moment. So when we think about what eye contact does, it allows us to connect with another person kind of in the same space, in the same time, about the same thing, and say, you know what? I see you, I'm with you, and I'm for you. So in our dialogues, what we can think about this is to create spaces, whether online or offline, where we can identify a shared point on the horizon, a shared conversational topic, a shared goal of how we want the world to be, a shared set of values. So even though we're not physically sharing the same space, if we're online, or even if we are sharing a similar physical space, recognizing that we're each unique, recognizing that there is a way of showing up where we can show through our eye contact and where we're looking, through our body posture and where we're turning, that we're with them, that we see them, and ultimately that we're for the good of all that is going on in the dialogue. And we do this through the hurry or listening model, right? So Judy Brownell is a listening scholar who said, you know what? Listening is not just hearing. Listening actually is a bigger process. So I'm just going to walk you through this process really quick. And I want you to think about your own listening. Where in this is this tough? Where in this is this actually easy for you? So it starts off in the top. The first step of listening is really being able to hear or see or concentrate on something very particular. So you're preparing to listen and you're connected. After you receive the message through hearing it, you work to understand it. You recognize what is being said, what is being assumed. You listen to the entire message and you distinguish what's the big ideas from what's the small ideas. What seems super accurate, what seems inaccurate. You're working to cognitively understand. Then you think about remembering what the person said in the moment, but also remembering what that conversation means in the broader context of your relationship with them, of the world, right? So this is just one moment of time, maybe, when you're having this conversation or this dialogue. But this dialogue is happening in a much longer story. A story for that individual, a story for this community. And so practicing memory to recall all the stuff that's really important to that story is a key part of listening well. All of that leads into interpretation. We need to figure out what each other is saying what we're saying as a group. And a lot of time that requires us to be empathetic, to be non-judgmental, to really hit the pause button and say, okay, let me listen to the whole thing. Let me be sensitive to what they're saying, what they're not saying, how they're interacting with me verbally and non-verbally, and also monitor your own behaviors, your own verbal and nonverbal cues, to say, you know what, I can be empathetic to others, but I can also be empathetic to myself and recognize that my interpretation of this moment is impacted by so many things. Am I hungry? Am I tired? Am I actually not remembering because I wasn't at that meeting? What is it that leads me to particular understandings of what this is based off of the messages I have access to? Then in the HURIER model, you move to evaluation. So you actually are thinking about, okay, does this idea have merit? Do I believe it? How does my own bias or my own perspectives, my own way I see the world impact whether I agree with this? What are the parts I do agree with? What are the parts that I don't agree with? How might their emotional situation be impacting whether or not I want to get on board or not? Whether the argument feels like it's logical, like it makes sense to me. So we kind of go through this evaluation process. And finally, in the listening model, we respond. We have to figure out how to respond in culturally appropriate ways. Is it okay to argue? Is it not okay to argue? Is it appropriate to yell? Is it not appropriate to yell? Is it appropriate to sit in silence, or do you have to speak? Is it appropriate to look at your phone as you're speaking, or read a book as you're speaking, or do you actually need to look that person in the eye? Online, is it appropriate to turn your video on or turn your screen off? Is it appropriate to mute your microphone or not? How do you look at your screen? Are you looking down at the person, or are you looking up at the person? So all those little cues become part of the process of you communicating. I see you, I'm with you, I'm for you. And the more flexible you can be in your responses, the more culturally appropriate you will be in the ways you engage other people. And I don't just mean culture as in a different country. I mean all those little things that we come to the table with our own personalities, with our own family backgrounds, with our own knowledge of how the world works. Those are going to impact our responses, and they're also going to impact other people's responses. So as you look at this big picture model, there's some pieces that you might find really easy. For example, I've spent a lot of time culturally navigating different spaces, so the process of responding has become more and more easy to me. But the remembering part can be really hard because I don't have a really great memory. I often live in the present moment or the future moment, and so things from the past might just get a little hazy. So knowing that's true about me as a listener, I need to be able to show up with enough humility to say, you know what, maybe I just don't get it. And can somebody remind me of what this was that we talked about, or how this impacts these people? And that ability to show up with humility in the parts of the listening that we just find really hard are really key to being good listeners in the dialogue and deliberation process. All right, we're almost there. So as we think about how we show this, I see you, I'm with you, I'm for you, how we show up at the table and invite other people through our listening to be there. As we think about the ways that we are motivated to listen, that we behave and respond in our listening, that we actually process in our brains what is going on, a huge part of being able to listen well is actually being able to minimize the noise that gets in the way of what we want to select as important. Right? So there's all different types of listening that people can talk about. Some people are really focused on the relationship, on the people at the table, of who they are and how they're feeling, and that everybody feels connected at the end. Some people are really focused on the task, like what do we got to get done? We only have this amount of time. We need action points. Other people are really focused on the message or the content. What is being said? Do I understand what that is? Do I understand that meaning? And analyzing every single part. Other people are really focused on the accuracy. They're fact checking. Is that true? Is that not true? Other people are focused on the aesthetics of the situation. There's all these things that we could attend to, remember? Because if you think back at the beginning of this conversation we were having, your listening can be what? Through your ears, it can be through your eyes, and it can be inside you too. So what we got to do in order to be able to really listen to each other well is to minimize noise. We need to minimize the physiological noise. So if you're tired, if you're hungry, those things can get in the way of you listening well. I often joke that in moments where I'm hangry, like I'm just hungry and it's making me really grumpy, I'm not in a great state to listen to you. You could have psychological noise. You know what? I have a big interview coming up and I'm really stressed about it and it makes it hard for me to listen to what you have to say. Or I am really depressed today, and so when you talk about this joyful thing, I know I'm supposed to be happy for you, but I don't feel happy today, right? There's all these things that are going in our heads that make it difficult to really tune into people. It might be physical noise. You know what? This room has too many people in it. This restaurant is too loud. I literally can't hear what you have to say. Or it could be semantic noise or cultural noise. You know what? I just don't understand your perspective on the world. Or I don't understand the language that you're speaking. All of those can be kinds of noise too. So in order to be really good listeners, we need to, one, really figure out what our intention is. What are we all going to focus on together as listeners? How are we going to listen? But then we also want to minimize all this noise as much as possible. Get enough sleep, get enough food, and if you can't, make it obvious to the people in your community, I don't have access to this, which makes it hard for me to show up in this space. As much as you possible, leave your troubles at the door and be present, be mindful, so that all of the other things that are going on don't adversely impact the conversation that you want to have. If the space is too loud, move, or try to figure out a way to make the space less loud, or figure out a way that hearing aids could be used or microphones could be used in a way to help everybody hear. If it's cultural difference, then maybe some extra time needs to be made to really understanding where people are coming from, their worldviews, their perspective on the world, to make sure that when we're listening to each other in the way that each other expects. So all of this, in summary, can debunk 5 listening myths. So hopefully it's obvious by now that myth 1, hearing and listening are the same thing, is just not true. Listening involves so much more than just our ears alone. Myth 2, listening is natural and effortless. We know this isn't true. As we're talking about all these different pieces that show up in our listening, there's a lot to attend to. There's a lot to work at. And that work can be really exhausting, but it's still worth it. Myth number 3, all listeners hear the same thing. This just isn't true because there's so many different kinds of noise that can come up for each one of us. We all have our own bodies. We all have our own experiences. And so we just can't engage what's happening in the same way. We need each other to get the most accurate perspective of the situation as possible. Myth 4, all listening is effective. Now this just can't be true because we don't always know what each other needs. Some days you might need somebody to listen to you and solve your problem. Another day you may need somebody to listen to you and just sit there in silence because the rapport there is more important than the solution. We've got to figure out what we intend with each other before moving forward in order to be effective listeners. And myth 5, the listener plays a passive and easier role in the communication process. This is just not true, and I would like to give you a little bit of a metaphor. If you've ever caravanned on a road before, when you have 2 cars and one's in front and one's in back, and you're the car in back, following the person in front of you. On long road trips that oftentimes it can be harder to be the person following, to keep the right amount of distance between you, to make sure that your speed is the same, to pass cars, to negotiate red lights, and still keep them in eyesight, than it is to be the person in front who is just driving and moving through the world in the everyday normal way that they would drive. And so the listener sometimes actually does more work because they have to track what the other people are saying and do the mental gymnastics necessary to stay with them each step of the way, each traffic light, if you will. And so the listener actually plays an incredibly active and often harder role in the communication process because they can't just take off with their words and say whatever they want and hope that other people will track. The listener has to be the one to stick with the driver even when it's hard. And there's a lot of things can get in the way. So in sum, all of this listening that we're doing, all the listening practice is really to get us to the final goal of dialogue. And I love this picture on the potter's wheel because really dialogue is about speakers and listeners, all of us coming together and shaping something together. The way that I listen impacts the way that you speak, and the way that you speak impacts the way that I listen. They are not disconnected. It's not like tennis where the ball goes one way and then goes the other. It's much more like we're shaping a pot together between us. And that thing is fragile. That thing can be beautiful, but it can also go wildly wrong. And so unless we share intentions of what our final goal is, and then join the process together, making micro changes to accommodate for each other, all of us might leave a dialogue space thinking, you know what? I wasn't seen. Nobody was with me, and nobody was for me. And that is the opposite of good listening. So in conclusion, what I want to just drive home is that there's a lot of moving parts in listening, but really so much of it can be boiled down to setting our intentions, making them clear with each other about what we're hoping we'll accomplish, minimizing noise, attending to all the different steps of that Hurrier model, of all the different parts of listening, and then ultimately being guided by the idea that we want communication climates. We want spaces that are confirming. We want spaces that feel good. We ultimately want spaces in which we listen through our words and through the way we move our faces and our bodies in ways that people feel seen, they feel heard, they know that you are wanting to learn with them, and that ultimately you're for their good. Thanks so much for being part of this. If you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to email me. I'm here to support you in the process of listening. Thanks.